I'm going to again introduce myself. I'm Ken Lusbader, one of the co-directors of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. And I want to thank Ellen Ellenzweig for presenting tonight on this wonderful book that was just published, George Platt Lynes, I should say The Daring Eye of George Platt Lynes, the cover of which is right that you're seeing. It is for sale through Oxford University Press, your local bookstore, or elsewhere, which you can imagine on your own. It begins with an A. I'm going to just briefly mention that we have another upcoming event on December 13th, Progressive Reformers and Lesbian Lives. And that's going to be presented by Andrew Dulcart. And it will also include our Katie Vogel from the Henry Street Settlement, who will be discussing the National Register nominations that we just submitted to the state of New York, and that will be hopefully on the National Register soon, regarding Lillian Wald's Homosocial World, who was one of the co-founders of the settlement. As many of you know, we are the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. We're a cultural heritage initiative and educational resource documenting sites throughout New York City related to LGBT history and culture. We're not only self-referential, such as Stonewall, which is obvious to everybody, but we also are looking at sites of cultural influence, such as George Platt Lynes and where he worked and where his works were exhibited. As you can see, we have about 375 sites on our website in all the boroughs related to these type of historic resources, and you can filter them on our website by significance, of cultural significance. To make it a little easier and less overwhelming, we've created 30+ types of themes that you can go in and look at our sites related to a theme, which is a wonderful launching point for people who are interested in a specific topic or a specific area of inquiry, and a launching point for more study. These are some of the sites that we've had listed on the National Register. When we started the project in 2015, there were 2 throughout the country on the National Register. Now there are officially about 22 specifically related to LGBT history. We're responsible for about 10 of them, including Stonewall, that was done pre-project by Andrew and Jay. That was the first ever to be listed on the National Register. We've also worked with the city to advocate for local landmark designation. We've also do walking tours when the pandemic is over. We did some over the summer, and we have a map that we created for the National Park Service that's handed out at the Stonewall National Monument, and these type of presentations. We are a not-for-profit, so your support helps us. So on this Giving Tuesday, if you feel so moved, anything counts, and you could find us on our website, which you'll have the links, and we have a wonderful Instagram and social media feed as well, as you can see here. I'm going to hand this over to Andrew, who's going to briefly mention some of the sites that we have on our website related to George Platt Lynes.
Thanks, Ken. So we have wanted to do a site about George Platt Lynes for a long time, and Lynes had a studio and lived in many different locations in Manhattan, mostly on the Upper East Side. And as it turned out, every single one of them had been demolished. And since we are about site-based, it was becoming very difficult. And Alan suggested that what we could do is the site of the Pierre Matisse Gallery, which was in the Fuller Building. You can notice the rather distinctive lower 6 floors of the Fuller Building on the image, which were designed specifically to house art galleries. And in 1942, Lynes had an exhibit of his portrait photography here. So we have used the Pierre Matisse Gallery and the Fuller Building as an entree, as a site to allow us to explore a site that deals with all the aspects of George Platt Lynes' photography. Of course, we're very interested in the male nude photographs, for which he has become very well known. But our entree is the Pierre Matisse Gallery. So we just posted a site about Lynes, And it has only 5 images at the moment, and they're all portraits, but we are planning on putting up more images. We just haven't gotten the rights yet to those. So in the next week or so, we hope to have a lot more images on that site. So, but we do have lines represented in a few other sites on our website. If you go to the next one,
Yep.
you'll see he's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. And we have entries for both Woodlawn Cemetery and Greenwood Cemetery that highlight the queer people that are buried or interred at these cemeteries. And we do tours in the spring and the fall of these cemeteries, and we plant rainbow flags at the sites. And you can see this is from our last Woodlawn Cemetery tour, where we planted a flag at George Platt Lynes' burial site. Next. Lynes was a childhood friend of Lincoln Kirstein's, and through much of his career, he and Kirstein had a relatively close relationship. And Kirstein was, as I'm sure many of you know, responsible for the founding of what's now City Ballet and its predecessor ballet companies. And George Platt Lynes became a very important ballet photographer because of his connection to Lincoln Kirstein. So he's represented there. And next, he's also was important for at the Museum of Modern Art, where he appeared in several important photography exhibits, including the MoMA's first ever photography show, and had close relationships with members of the staff at MoMA also. So there are a number of sites where you can delve further into Lynes and his life. And I'm going to hand it back to Ken, who's going to introduce Alan.
Thank you. And again, this is a great opportunity to learn about George Platt Lynes, but I recently received the book. It's a wonderful, large publication. So congratulations, Alan. And I'm going to just read a brief bio, and then I'll let Alan take it from there. Alan Ellenzweig is a cultural critic and commentator who has published in numerous arts and general interest publications, including The Village Voice and Art in America. His landmark, as well as online in the tablet, The Forward and Poetry magazine. His landmark History, the homoerotic photograph, Male Images from Duryea to Delacroix to Mapplethorpe, was published in 1992. He is a regular contributor to the Gay and Lesbian Review /Worldwide and teaches at the writing program at Rutgers University. His biography, as I said, George Platt Lynes, was just published this month. So thank you for the opportunity to learn about George Platt Lynes and to share the information and the extensive research that you've done. Thank you.
Okay, so we start with the young and the older George Platt Lynes. George grew up basically between New Jersey and Great Barrington. Most of his youth was spent in Great Barrington. His father was the rector of the St. James Episcopal Church there. And here we go. Okay. So he was a student at the Berkshire School for Boys. And one of the people who was one of the students there that he was not actually all that friendly with was Lincoln Kirstein, who you see here. They didn't exactly get on well. I think they sort of smelled each other out, and somehow it wasn't a happy experience. Lincoln confided to his diary while at Berkshire that he thought George was, and I quote, a sneering little bitch who never really gets below the varnish of anything, whether it be poetry, drawing, or talking. His life is a pose. He fancies he is pretty to look at and saunters through the post office, into the reading room, to the library, and back, waving his extremities. Okay, Lincoln, why don't you tell us what you really think? My cursor is not visible. And I don't know why. There we go. Okay. I think I'm going to stick to, all right. George never actually finished his coursework at Berkshire, but went on to Paris in the late spring after graduate, actually before formal graduation, because he was going to finish his coursework and his preparatory work for Yale. His mother had cousins who lived in Paris, and through them, he was introduced to the Stein Topless Salon. He was extremely young. He was only, what, 18 at the time, but she integrated him into her salon, which was increasingly gay in the 1920s, as opposed to the salon of the pre-war and immediate post-war First World War era. And she was impressed with him. He impressed her and her acolytes. When he returned to America, he arranged with her to publish an essay she had written called Descriptions of Literature, and he would publish it as a subscription chapbook. So he used his time in Paris quite well, getting to know Gertrude and Alice, and returning to America with this important project in hand. When he was in New York, actually not in New York, he was in Englewood, he was contacted by the woman you see here, whose name was Bernardine Zold. She was a journalist living abroad in Paris, knew Gertrude Stein, and was friendly with two writers and publishing people. On top, Monroe Wheeler, below Glenway Westcott. Glenway Westcott was already an emerging novelist of the period, part of the lost generation, in some competition with Hemingway, although that may have been more in Hemingway's mind than in Glenway Westcott. And the gentleman who is above him is Monroe Wheeler. Monroe Wheeler was a publisher of poetry chapbooks and rather successful at it, publishing people like Marion Moore, for example, and Ivor Winters. And what Bernardine Zoll recommended was, since these two gentlemen were going to New York on business, she said, you should meet George Platt Lynes. He's a wonderful young man. And conversely, she told George the same thing. Monroe and Glenway are going to be in New York. Make sure to meet them. Well, I won't go into the details of what transpired, except to say that, as you might guess, looking at this photograph, George glommed on to Monroe unabashedly, with absolutely no concern that he might be breaking up an existing couple. I don't even know if he was quite aware that the two men he met in New York were a long-standing couple of roughly 10 years. In any case, he and Monroe was as taken with George as George was with him, became a couple, though not a permanent feature of their lives, since Monroe and Glenway were basically living abroad in France, and George was not yet living abroad. But he managed to begin traveling more often to Europe so that he could spend time with his two favorite people. And here we see them on one of their trips in Europe. They did travel through Austria and Germany, for example. And this really, and at this time, George was trying to become a writer, partly, I think, because Monroe kept introducing him as an emerging novelist. In his business dealings, Monroe met up with a woman named Barbara Harrison, who was a wealthy heiress, whose father had been the Governor General of the Philippines. She was quite cultivated, well-educated, and she and Monroe formed a company called Harrison of Paris, and they determined to publish deluxe illustrated editions of both classic work like Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, and more contemporary material, as, for example, a volume of poetry by Glenway himself. The gentleman we see here is Lloyd Westcott, Glenway Westcott's younger brother. And when all of them, I mean by that, Monroe, Glenway, and Barbara returned to America in about 1934 as the political situation in Europe was becoming dicey, and publishing the books for Harrison of Paris was becoming vastly more expensive. Barbara returned to New York following upon the heels of Monroe and Glenway, and almost immediately was introduced to Lloyd Westcott, who we see here, and fell in love with him, and they married. Now, George had begun taking photographs really as an amateur, and these are two of the amateur photographs he took. He had visited in the south of France, where Glenway and Monroe spent a good deal of time, first staying at the Hotel Welcome, which was Jean Cocteau, this gentleman here, Jean Cocteau's base in the south of France, where many, many writers and artists hung around. It was a scene, and they participated in it until the point at which it was becoming increasingly difficult for Glenway to actually get work done. And then they took a villa up the hill. Hotel Welcome, by the way, was in Villefranche. So they went up the hill, found a villa, and Glenway was able to get his work done. The photograph of Gertrude Stein, I would suspect George took in about 1927 or 28. That's about the period that these two amateur photographs were taken. And when Glenway and Monroe returned to Inglewood on a visit to see George, they spent an evening with him, and he wound up showing them photographs he'd been taking. And almost immediately, they sensed that he had an incredible raw talent, first as a portraitist, and in other genres as well. And they recommended that he try to take up photography because he was not a happy writer. He had written a manuscript of 20,000 words and just got rid of it. So he did, in fact, take up photography. Now, in the late 20s, in particular in the early 30s, George, who was not always in the company of Monroe and Glenway, who were off in France, began to make inroads into the cultural salons of New York. And of course, his previous contact with Gertrude Stein was something of a calling card. Muriel Draper had earlier had a salon in London. In New York, now divorced. She maintained a spotty career as an interior decorator, and despite financial difficulty, made her loft above the coach house on East 40th Street a magnet for the smart set, which included friends in the arts like the writer, photographer, and dance critic Carl Van Vechten, the publisher Alfred Knopf and his wife Blanche, and the African-American actor and singer Paul Robeson and his wife Islanda. Draper's guests might include working-class laborers and bodybuilders, alongside London aristocrats and Parisian trendsetters, artists and writers, opera singers, cabaret performers, socialist organizers, and Gurdjieff disciples. George's former Berkshire acquaintance, Lincoln Kirstein, sorry, I didn't mean to advance, Lincoln Kirstein, who we see here, was also a regular at Draper's salon. Kirstein, aged 20 in 1927 and 2 decades younger than Draper, at the same age as her son Paul, began a decade-long, periodically sexual affair with her that intensified when Kirstein finished his studies at Harvard and moved to New York. This is a photograph of Muriel Draper, by the way, here by George Platt Lynes. Her persona was as distinctive as Gertrude Stein's, though in a different key. She wore turbans, gold ones for parties, and long earrings, and conducted conversation with a long cigarette holder as a baton. Her speech patterns were equally remarkable, cerebral and colloquial, combining American and English accents, mixing Mandarin pronouncements with sudden intimacy. Her politics were decidedly left-wing, which was in marked contrast to Gertrude Stein, who moved increasingly to an eccentric right-wing stance. And, however, like Stein, Draper was given to didactic pronouncements about art and the human condition. For a young man of George's aesthetic and homosexual sensibility, Draper's Salon was as much a haven in New York as the Stein Salon at 27 Rue de Fleurus had been in Paris. Draper welcomed people of varied sexual tastes and ignored typical racial barriers, according to her son Paul, who we see here in this photograph, this young man here. Her evening gatherings and her twice weekly teas, he found there were perhaps more homosexuals per room than anywhere. Stephen Watson, a close chronicler of the period, explains that Draper's extravagant clothes and theatrical pronouncements disinhibited gay men. In her salon, the discrepancy between sexual identity and its public expression was minimal, without proper guests to hide from, and with few social rules to mediate. Homosexuals and lesbians moved in the Draper Salon without social friction. Romany Marie is quite an interesting character, a real village character, Greenwich Village character, that is. Her name is Marie Marchand. She was a Romanian Jew who presented as a kind of Roma Earth Mother. She opened her first European-style bistro, Parisian Salon, Cafe, at the corner of Sheridan Square in 1914, and became known for her Turkish coffee, which she would serve with a complimentary reading of the patron's fortune. Once she gave George a palm reading with no specific advice, yet she spoke with a power and insight that moved him more than words could express. He writes, the telling of it was so bracing and direct, so simple and understanding. She finished by kissing me with great affection and left me rather bewildered and very humble, and I could think of her now as a friend. Throughout the course of 35 years, her establishment changed location at least a dozen times. She would leave a note overnight, quote, the caravan has moved, and change location. Other locations included 55 Grove Street, which is next to what is now Marie's Crisis, St. Mark's Place, Washington Square South, and the basement of the Hotel Revort. The taverns were often hidden up several flights of stairs or located at the ends of alleyways. Notable guests at Marie's included Diego Rivera, Orson Welles, and the novelist Fanny Hurst. Everyone who was anyone on the art scene passed through Marie's. He was a Vesuvius of creativity and heart and mind, recalled Buckminster Fuller. Another salon was the Kirk and Constant Askew Salon, located at 166 East 61st. George Platt Lynes remained conscious that his association with Stein gave him social capital in the New York of Muriel Draper and Kirk Constant Askew. They were a couple whose Upper East Side salon also brought together the cosmopolitan crowd with Sunday tea at 5 in the afternoon, which became cocktails at 6. The Askew salon was more formal than Muriel Draper's. Gentlemen were expected in evening wear, that is, a dark suit or black tie, not a tuxedo, Kirk would instruct his grandson many years later. Waiters wear tuxedos, gentlemen wear dinner jackets. The Askews could have been in the social register, but they declined the honor. Their at-homes were not parties. This is, by the way, from John Houseman, who was a frequent guest. He writes, their at-homes were not parties, but a continuing, well-organized operation with a clear and consistent objective. Weekly gathering included a band of young men, art dealers, historians, museum curators, most of them trained by Paul Sachs at Harvard, for whose artistic and professional benefit the salon existed and functioned. The reunions were held each Sunday from 5 on in a large drawing room overlooking a garden. And for serious artistic or personal dialogue, there was the small library, which the hostess used as her study. Through these two rooms circulated the notabilities, some 4 or 5 dozen each Sunday, evenly divided, as a rule, between the sexes. Flirtation, homo and heterosexual, was tolerated but not encouraged. Art dealer Julian Levy called it the best and most culturally fertile salon I was to know in the 30s. Philip Johnson referred to the Askew evenings as, we have it here, a concatenation of Harvard and homosexuals and modernism as a creed. Kirk and Constant Askew Salon may have been a decorous setting for homosexuals to enact their cultural solidarity, but under tacit prohibitions against overt behaviors or advocacy. Virgil Thompson remembered, "You did not camp at the Askews. If you rubbed their noses in it, you weren't going to be asked around." Yet, as Steve Watson put it, the Askews seem to have encouraged a cosmopolitan version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but they would have experienced it as do more, say less. And finally, the third of the salons is, well, this is not actually a salon. This is Julian and Joella Levy's gallery, which may have operated ultimately as a salon. Julian Levy is one of the young Harvard-oriented art men who attended the Askew Salon. His wife, Joella, we see here in a photograph, portrait by George Platt Lynes, was the daughter of the feminist poet and painter Minna Loy. George's immediate impressions of Levy was that he is a very handsome, lazily ambitious, and prosperous young man who was going to open a gallery exclusively devoted to photography. Well, that was not entirely true. Levy was also devoted to modern painting. His early surrealist show of January 1932, the first of its kind in New York, was unpretentiously assembled with a light heart, accidents, unorthodox ideas, and plenty of pleasure. He included photographs by the young Lynes, claiming they were, quote, improvised by several of us in my apartment, with George manipulating the lighting and snapping shutters on a potpourri of objects. George, however, saw this in a different light. He wrote Monroe that they are trying to make a surrealist of me. George had no interest in the theories and the manifestos on which the surrealists thrived. It is also probable that George was aware, through his prior association with Jean Cocteau and the surrealist poet René Crevel, that under the implacable leadership of Andre Breton, doctrinaire surrealists found homosexuality abhorrent. Ultimately, however, Julian showed George's work in the duo exhibition with Walker Evans, this in February of 32, and in the spring, the large group show, Photographs of New York by New York Photographers, where Lynes's early street scenes that he shot as his first and only experiment in that style of documentation. I wanted you to get some sense of his early portrait work. This is Andre Gide, the photographer, quite young image of the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. This is the surrealist poet who was the exception to the rule. He was kind of an official member of the surrealist group. This is a portrait of Catherine Ann Porter, who was published by the Harrison of Paris company, I believe twice, and became a great, close, intimate friend of Monroe, Glenway, and George. And this nude, an early nude, is very possibly a nude of Lloyd Westcott, Glenway's younger brother. So many of the talented artists who joined to bring four saints in 3 acts to life, the opera by Gertrude Stein, libretto, Virgil Thompson, music, here's Virgil. They emerged from the Kirk and Constant Askew salons in New York and London. These were social laboratories for bringing together creative sensibilities. Virgil wrote the music to Gertrude Stein's libretto, and Thompson invited John Houseman to be the opera's director. Which was Houseman's first such endeavor. Sorry, I've lost my place. Later, Thompson and Frederick Ashton, who Constance Askew invited to do the choreography, lived in the New York townhouse of the Askews, while the physical production was being prepared. The reason I show the Savoy Ballroom next is that this is where Frederick Ashton was encouraged to go to select dancers who could be the performers in the opera of Four Saints and Three Acts. Virgil Thompson had decided that all of the performers in Four Saints and Three Acts would be African American. And in part, it was because of Jimmy Daniels, who was a cabaret singer. He had experience back in France during the 20s and early 30s. He was the host at Harlem Ta-Cha, which was a classy dive frequented by the era's white smart set, like Noel Coward and Tallulah Bankhead. And Virgil Thompson reasoned that the impeccable enunciation of Daniels' speech and song, which was his way of delivering song, confirmed Virgil's decision to have his opera performed entirely by Blacks. The Savoy Ballroom was a huge place. It was 10,000 square feet. It could hold up to 4,000 people. It was in Harlem on Lenox Avenue and 140th Street. And it was, unlike many ballrooms, such as the Cotton Club, it had a non-discrimination policy. The clientele was 85% Black and 15% white, although sometimes there was an even split. Patrons were judged on their dancing skills, not on the color of their skin. One night, somebody came over and said, "Hey man, Clark Gable just walked in the house." Somebody else said, "Oh yeah, can he dance?" Some years later, by the way, Four Saints and Three Acts was presented in 1934 at the Wadsworth Athenaeum up in Hartford, Connecticut. It did come to Broadway, which was quite extraordinary. It was the first opera in which Blacks were composed. The entire cast were paid for rehearsals. That had never happened. And it was quite a success on Broadway as well. Now, why was Jean Cocteau in Coney Island? Because he and his lover, Marcel Kiel, who we see here, were making a round-the-world tour, which was a kind of bet that Cocteau made with a French magazine, that he could fulfill the same round-the-world tour that Jules Verne had done in Around the World in 80 Days. Well, that Phineas, I guess. Phineas, I'm not sure of the name anymore. But anyway, so one of their last stops was New York. They met up with their good friends, Monroe, Glenway, and George. And Monroe wrote that we took Cocteau to lunch at the Rockefeller Grill. And later they took him out to Coney Island. Their jaunt to Coney Island was done on the subway. And Cecil Beaton, who we see here, who was in New York at the time, wrote in his diary, "If it had been a trip to the Far East, it could not have been more exciting. When they were on the subway, they were swinging from the handrails." And to memorialize their trip, they were in a photographer's studio like this, where there was this flowered trellis. It looks like they're about to walk down the wedding aisle, although I don't think all 5 of them could fit. As you see here, George is in the front, acting as a kind of, I don't know, a sort of master of ceremonies, presenting all of the fellows behind him. So we have here the world's gay male cultural forces meeting in a moment of high levity. We have Jean Cocteau, poet, novelist, and filmmaker, the Englishman Cecil Beaton, photographer, illustrator, scenic and costume designer, and diarist, the American Glenway Westcott, a poet and expatriate novelist returned to America like a prodigal son, and George Platt Lynes, who was a precocious literary publisher and photographer. And of course, Marcel Kiel, who would join the list of young men who George Platt Lynes would photograph nude or semi-nude, as we see here, Marcel Kiel, with drawings on his body and underneath. I suspect that these are line drawings by Jean Cocteau. And the fact that they were all together in Coney Island, enjoying themselves, just makes one think that whatever the social restraints they may have lived under in England, France, and America, each of these artists contributed by his personal demeanor and by his art to an easing of restrictions on the border between public and private homosexuality. Glenway Westcott, a year later, recalled the trip to Luna Park, saying, portals and towers in a fog are all I remember, and long wet wreaths of light bulbs. No one ever told me of the elegance and infant splendor inside the enclosures, particularly the one called Luna Park, as we see here. George became the ballet photographer of all of the companies that ultimately resulted in the New York City Ballet, all of the Lincoln Kirstein, George Balanchine companies. Lincoln brought Balanchine over from Paris. Of course, Balanchine was an emigre from revolutionary Russia. And what we saw just previously was a relatively early American ballet by Balanchine from 1936, but they didn't have a permanent home yet. And for a number of years, Balanchine was actually making his living on Broadway and out in Hollywood. And at that time, Lincoln would take the reins and wanted to create American ballets on American subject matter with American choreographers and composers, which he did for a number of years. And Balanchine returned to the theme of Orpheus, although previously it was Orpheus and Eurydice. This is called Orpheus simply. And these were photographs that George Platt Lynes did, he said, for fun, because they could not be used publicly. Why? Because he had Nicolas Magallanes and Francisco Mancion, two of the dancers, nude. I wanted you to see a series of typical 1940s portraits that George did in his studio at 640 Madison Avenue, which is where he worked for a good 10 years. And I've always just loved this rather oddly composed portrait of a nude man sitting in a director's chair. It just has some odd, slightly surrealist, but also fanciful quality to it. And here, though, we see three, what I would say are signature styles. Well, it's one signature style, three different persons, where George would throw the shadows on the rear wall and thereby give the subject, who is foregrounded, an almost heroic dimension. We have here Marsden Hartley, we have here Marion Moore, and here a young man whose name was Harris, but George titled it the Great Barrington Boy. I suspect because the young man actually looks a bit like George did at his age. And I think this young man called up ghosts of George's own youth. We get to the Pierre Matisse Gallery, which is where excuse me, Andrew, I have to correct you. In 1941, this retrospective of portraits from George Lynes's corpus was presented for a few weeks. George had negotiated with Pierre Matisse for a 2-week exhibition. The title of the exhibition was 200 Portraits by George Platt Lynes, plus an assortment of less formal pictures of people. You will see here, this is the cover of Dance Index. The photograph itself was used as the entranceway welcome as you entered the exhibition. Monroe Wheeler designed a most beautiful and small exhibition catalog, which listed all of the people who were present in the photographs. So we have people, I mean, just look at the front page, the first page, not first, but the third perhaps. Colette, Aaron Copland, Joan Crawford, Salvador Dali, Raymond Duncan, the brother of Isadora Duncan, Max Ernst, Kirsten Flagstead. It just goes on and on. It was an extraordinary list of people that George had photographed over probably about 5, 6 years by that point. In 1942, there was an exhibition of emigre exiles, artists in exile at the Pierre Matisse Gallery. George took the photograph, which as a photograph is not particularly interesting. It looks like nothing more than a board of directors. You'd never know that they were artists, but it is indeed an extraordinary list of artists, everyone from Max Ernst to Jacques Lipchitz to Pavel Chelichev. And so, although it's not aesthetically an important photograph, historically, it is a quite important photograph. George never really thought of himself as a great fashion photographer. I happen to think that this image is a great fashion photograph. I don't have the time to tell you why. You'll have to take my word for it. You can ask me if you wish. But unfortunately, he felt that too often when he took his fashion photographs, I've had a plan, a background, a composition, or atmosphere in my head that has had to be abandoned because last-minute requirements have made it impracticable or inappropriate. Nearly always, my fashion jobs are hurry up, helter-skelter, devil take the hindmost. He and Glenway tried to do a book of mythological photographs that Glenway would write the captions for, or not captions, little précis of the person or persons in the image. This is Actaeon. This is Boreas, the god of the north wind. Actaeon, the hunter who is turned into a stag and is ultimately his own dogs, not recognizing him, tear him to shreds. That's the mini version of the mythological story. By the way, that book never came off, unfortunately. He maintained wide relationships with many, many artists and very close relationships with Paul Cadmus and Jared French. Jared, they had been lovers for a good 10 years, I would suppose, when Jared wound up marrying Margaret French, who was somewhat older than him, and herself a very considerable artist. Here's a portrait of the three of them, that is George, Glenway, and Monroe, at the country property which Barbara Harrison Westcott gave them when she and Lloyd moved to a farm out in New Jersey. And on the property were some homes that needed refurbishing. And she made a gift of this so that they would have in perpetuity, or as long as their relationship lasted, a country home. This is Jared's version of the three of them. This, by the way, is not actually a triptych. It is three separate portraits. And as you can see, I've quoted the art historian and artist Jonathan Weinberg. Portraiture is a means of networking and an advertisement for both the sitter and the portraitist. One way an artistic circle constitutes itself as such is through portraits of its members. And this was absolutely the modus operandi of all the artists who were representational artists in the circle that surrounded George, Jared, and Paul Cadmus. They all photographed each other, they drew each other, they painted one another. George took a photograph of their working studio. Paul is here in the foreground. Paul's new lover, George Tucker, in the middle, and all the way back there is Jared French. This is at 5 St. Luke's Place in Greenwich Village. And this is a photograph of the building. This is Paul, in fact, painting what was known as Stone Blossom, a conversation piece. And here's George Tucker with Jared and Paul looking on. Here is one of the last places that George lived. It was his Hell's Kitchen walk-up. He was in desperate financial straits at the time. He abandoned his East 52nd Street apartment and moved into the much cheaper Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, which was a rough neighborhood on Midtown Manhattan's far west side. He said to his mother that it was damned inconvenient, not quite a slum, but still, oh, definitely a tenement. He refashioned the interior because he always had to live as if he were wealthy. So he made it a little bit of a jewel box. And nevertheless, the major drawback was that there was no central heating. And he had to haul up 4 flights of stairs, a 75-pound bag of coal from the street, ever so occasionally. Nevertheless, he, kept the party going. He always had dinner parties, always had friends come over. One Christmas, he adorned the apartment with masses of surplus Christmas trees, creating a magical setting. He hosted dinner parties. His brother Russell remembered one where the company included George Balanchine and his soon-to-be new wife, dancer Tanakil Leclerc, whom George extolled as a lovely girl and wonderful dancer, and we all dote on her. Lynes joined many others in appreciating her before polio tragically ended her career. He ultimately left Hell's Kitchen because he discovered just how dangerous the neighborhood was. Somebody had been murdered on his front step, and two of his male guests, had been set upon leaving his apartment at 1:30 in the morning. Given that everyone knows that George photographed the male nude, I thought I simply couldn't show you a presentation of his work without including a nod to the male nudes, which were prized by Kinsey. Many of them, a good number of them, and the negatives are housed at the Kinsey Institute. In the book, there's much more information about the relationship between Kinsey and George, and Kinsey and the others. And this is a quite beautiful image that George titled Man in His Element. There's a lot of backstory to this image, which once again you can discover in the book. I don't want to abuse my time. I've already no doubt abused my time. And that's the cover of the book. And I thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was wonderful, and no bearing needed. No, we were all working through technical issues. There was one question I just noticed when you were discussing Stone Blossom. There was a question: where was it? Where is it actually located?
It's next to the Mohawkaway River.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember the name of the exact town.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it in my head right now. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Is it in the book?
By the way, it doesn't exist anymore because in the 1950s, state of New Jersey had to take it over by eminent domain. They were flooding that whole region,
Mm-hmm.
and the home is somewhere underwater.
Mm-hmm. And who was it painted by again? That was
painted by Paul Cadmus.
Okay, that was
Yep.
another question that just came up.
Yeah.
I mean, we can open this up to questions if there are questions in the chat. I guess my general question is, I mean, there are a lot, but where does he fit in terms of the, art history, and what obviously the last image, it evokes Mapplethorpe, but where does he fit in technically and historically? And in writing and researching the book, what has been your personal take on him as an individual? He seemed, I mean, again, I'll shut up, but the one anecdote in the book that I've read only 50 pages is that at age 11, he added the Platt to his name he sounded quite grand and posh of himself.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
He really had this vision of himself as, he should have been an aristocrat. In
Mhm.
fact, I think the more telling story is the story about him. He was dropped off at the barber shop in Great Barrington by his father. His father was going to come back and pick him up. And George proceeded to tell the barbers that he wasn't really the son of this rector. He was a Russian aristocrat, and he had been left in their care here in America.
Mhm.
He just now, of course, as he matured, he knew better.
Mhm.
But he had a serious problem. He liked to live well, but he lived almost always beyond his means,
Mhm.
and so he was very often borrowing money,
Mhm.
and often borrowing money from friends.
Mhm.
And fortunately, many of his friends allowed him to do this because he was so generous with their money.
Mhm.
That is to say, you know, party, party, party. Uh, kept the alcohol flowing,
Mhm.
and he was also generous with his time and his loyalty and companionship. To answer your previous question, where does he fit in history? Um, I began to see that he doesn't fit. He's not among the greats of the 20th century. You can't place him next to Alfred Stieglitz or Steichen, but I consider him sort of sui generis. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but he's unique unto himself, which is to say that he was a commercial photographer, basically earned his living with fashion photography and celebrity photography, but he brought to it such imagination, a flair for the dramatic, an incredible technical skill using light and shadow, um, and certainly in terms of male nude, he was dealing with a subject matter that very, very few people were dealing with. Yes, I know that Horst did male nudes. I'm sure that Hoyningen did as well. Many gay photographers would have dealt with it. George obsessed over the male nude. It was his most important uh, work, but it couldn't be seen. It couldn't be published. It was rarely published. The only publication that I know of is a European publication called Der Kreis, which means the circle, and he did publish there over a matter of a few years in the 1950s. But you couldn't sell this kind of work. It would have been considered obscene. You couldn't send it through the mails.
Right.
It could be you could be charged with mailing obscenity. People forget what it was like
Mhm.
uh, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in
And,
terms of nudity.
and to follow up on where he fits in, there's a question that came in from Chuck Kaminsky, which is, I mentioned Mapplethorpe. Who did he influence? And Mapplethorpe, Warhol, so forth.
I usually depend on three major photographic names. Uh, and I'm almost sure I know two out of the three definitely knew George Platt Lynes' work. Mapplethorpe definitely knew it. He visited George Platt Lynes' great friend Bernard Perlin. Bernard Perlin was somewhat the heir to George's work, and had an enormous trove of it. And Mapplethorpe and his close friend Sam Wagstaff visited to look at that trove of photographs. So certainly Mapplethorpe. Dwayne Michaels is very enamored of George Platt Lynes, and I would include Herbert Ritz as well.
And
Because, yeah.
Another question from Chuck was all his work in black and white. Did he do any color? And then another question was, what is his relationship, or what was his relationship with Cecil Beaton?
Cecil Beaton and he were, I would say, professional colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and friendly, but I wouldn't say that they were the closest of friends. I forgot what your other question was.
Was it all in black and white, or did he photograph in color? Did any of the fashion photographs, were there commercial photographs in color?
I have read that he did some work in color. I have
Mhm.
not seen that work. It
Mhm.
was certainly not the center of his professional career.
Mhm.
He may have done some of it, for the magazines. He was a Condé Nast, part of the Condé Nast group photographer. So maybe on occasion he had commissions that needed to be in color.
Mhm.
I haven't seen them.
There's a question that just came in. What was his relationship with his brother Russell?
He and Russell were very, very close growing up. And Russell adored George and looked up to his older brother. And however, Russell somewhat overtook George, not in that he became more famous, although Russell was a considerable figure. He was managing editor of Harper's Magazine for many years. But he overtook him in that he was more of a grown-up than George was. George did not know how to handle his business affairs very well. He was chronically borrowing money from Russell. And although Russell did this to help his brother, there were several points in their mature relationship when Russell was really, frankly, pissed off at George for the way he was borrowing money constantly, not getting his affairs in good order. So there was a great tension there. But nevertheless, I would absolutely say that Russell loved his brother. He wrote, unfortunately, an unpublished manuscript, which was essentially a biography, which everybody who writes seriously about George Platt Lynes consults that manuscript, because it's the only previous biography that we have. So you don't do that unless you love the person you're writing about.
Another question, just that you didn't touch on, and we should before we end this, was he died at a young age. So what year did he die? How did he die? And what was that illness like in affecting his photography and his friendships?
Yeah. He had a very rough 2 years in 53 and 54 in terms of his health. He had pneumonia twice. But in 1955, in the spring, he wound up having exploratory surgery because he was beginning to cough up blood. And when they opened him, it was quite clear that he had inoperable lung cancer. And they didn't even try to do anything beyond sew him back up again, give him radiation treatment. It extended his life some months. He died in December of 1955. At that time, he was in the hospital again. But he did have just enough time between the spring and December to make a farewell tour of Europe. He hadn't been back in Europe in about 20 years. His close friendships remained. Although he and Monroe and Glenway had parted company as a threesome in 1943, they remained very strong friends, the three of them. And it was quite heartbreaking when George died. I think it was extremely tough on both Glenway and Monroe.
A question came in, which I think is the case, that he smoked. They wanted someone, in a lot of the photographs, he's seen smoke with a cigarette.
You got it. They all smoked.
Right.
It seemed like everybody smoked. George continued smoking even after his 2 bouts with pneumonia.
Mhm.
I mean, he just couldn't quite grow up.
Mhm.
I hate to say it that way, but he didn't, he was sort of irresponsible
Mm.
with his own health.
And then another question is, where are his photographs housed? I mean, I know a lot you mentioned are at Kinsey.
Yeah, the male nudes are, that's the best place to go to see the male nudes. But the Guggenheim Museum has a considerable George Platt Lynes collection. The Metropolitan Museum has George Platt Lynes material. Center for Creative Photography out in New Mexico, I believe, has a lot of George Platt Lynes. The Ransom Center at the University of Texas has some George Platt Lynes. He is all over. No one place has it all.
Mhm.
The one place that does have a lot of primary documentation is the Blaneke Library at Yale. That's where I did the majority of my research.
Mhm. I think in the interest of time, it's almost 7:45. There's one question: are there any photographs of him later in life? Do they exist?
Well, later in life, he's 48 years old. That's
Right.
how late his life is. So
Mhm.
yes, there are photographs of him in his 40s, including self-portraits. And sometimes you can see, but only with a retrospective glance, you can see that he doesn't look well. He
Mhm.
doesn't look well in that photograph. But we only can see that, I think, because we know what his fate is.
Mhm.
If we didn't know that, I'm not sure we'd be able to say that.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, completely enlightening and really demonstrating the sort of homosocial world that he lived in through his privilege and his friendships, but how creative they were on each other, which is something that we've tried to make the point as a project that, LGBTQ people didn't live in isolation, and those that were creative played off on each other, both architecturally, literature, playwrights and so forth. So this is a clear demonstration of that, and it's wonderful to see those images. And thank you for helping us locate. We were going back and forth, Alan and I were going back and forth so much with sites that we could possibly have. And as Andrew said, we needed to find a standing site as a preservation project. So we're happy to have the Matisse Gallery on there and so forth. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for your patience, and go buy the book because it's really not only interesting, but kind of fun to read. These are people who live their lives as if contemporary gay men live their life in a very open out way.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.